For those of you who have been able to attend any of the 2 prior meetings, we're going to use a really similar format, as that seems to be working pretty well. Just as a reminder, please keep yourself muted to avoid background noises, and keep your video off as well. That's appreciated. We've been using the chat box in our meetings to allow people to ask questions, and that's worked pretty well too. So if you've got a question as the slides progress and you want to enter it into the chat box, that's really helpful to do. And when we pause at different places along the way, we can pull those questions up kind of in order and read those, and then allow whoever's asked the question to they can unmute themselves to add any clarifications as we talk through that. So we'll have several places along the way where we'll pause for questions today. This meeting is being recorded, and like the other meetings we've had so far, will be posted to the potential study website for folks that weren't able to join or want to go back and listen to the recording. The slides themselves will also be posted. Usually takes a couple days for those to get uploaded. Today's agenda has got a couple items here. First one that we'll jump into after we get into some discussion of the study schedule will be the potential study measures. Hopefully you all received an email from me a few weeks ago identifying a draft list of measures for review, and thanks to everyone who's provided feedback so far. Aquila will talk through the measure list and the analytical approach for measure characterization, and get into emerging technologies, behavioral and process measures specifically. From there, we'll come back to a topic that's been discussed on a couple of the other prior stakeholder meetings surrounding how potential is framed in the study report. We're calling it scenario potential. That's where we were previously talking about achievable potential. We're going to talk through what's been going on, discussions that's been going on with PSC and with different stakeholders since the last meeting, talking through a revised approach that includes a discussion of some terminology that we're recommending going forward. The last topic is data collection update. The last meeting back in June talked about some of the challenges with virtual site visits and the proposed approach to data collection. We're going to get an update on how that pilot virtual site visit process is going. Talk through commercial and agricultural surveys, residential panel and industrial expert interviews, and then end the meeting with an additional Q&A session. This slide is showing a timeline of the major milestones for the potential study. So as I mentioned, this is the 3rd meeting. Kicked off in May, had a 2nd meeting in late June. Today's meeting primarily focused on measure characterization, which will lead into the next stakeholder meeting, which will come sometime in the next few months this winter, talking about potential analysis and scenarios as that measure list gets finalized. And then looking forward, draft results of the study will be developed in the spring, with reporting coming out of that, and then final results in the summer. And all of that leads into the broader quad planning process for focus. So the quad 4 of focus will begin in 2023. So the potential study is kind of a first step along the way to inform that process. Following the potential study, next fall we'll begin scoping for quad planning. There'll be stakeholder comment periods there. That'll lead into a commission staff memorandum, also opportunities for stakeholder engagement and comment on that, and then ultimately commission decisions for the next quad come in the summer of 2022, in time to begin quad 4, January 1, 2023. So that's high-level overview of this study, and then the quad planning process that it feeds into. So that's where we are today. That's kind of all I wanted to discuss here at the onset to kind of bring people back to where we are. And I'm going to hand it over to Aquila, who's going to jump into the potential study measures portion.
Thank you, Mitch. Hello, everyone. Good to be here. Hopefully you guys can hear me all right.
Yes.
Great, thank you. As Mitch noted, on August 27th, Mitch had sent out from PSE a draft measure list, and hopefully you have all received it. If you haven't received the draft measure list, it is available on Focus on Energy's Potential Study website. If you don't know where that is located, you can always email Jeremy or Mitch, and we'll happily send you an email with a spreadsheet attachment. I would like to spend a few minutes just talking about just sort of how to orientate yourself around the measure list that was provided before I jump into sort of the analytical methodology for the measures. And really how to best review the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet that was provided has 4 sector tabs within the workbook: residential, commercial, agricultural, and industrial. The first few columns within each tab provides a measure description. For example, it will note the sector, the fuel type, the vintage, the end use application for each measure. It will also provide measure details, such as the measure name and the efficiency of that measure, as well as baseline details. And this will help provide context of what the savings and the costs are going to be compared to. The second set of columns are reference columns, and they provide some context for each of the measures. Is it a new measure added to this study compared to the prior study in 2017? Are there state codes and federal standards that are impacting this measure? Are the behavioral or emerging technologies are these behavioral or emerging technologies? And is this measure found within the existing TRM for Wisconsin or within focus programs? And so it helps you sort of sort through the measures. I will say it's a relatively comprehensive measure list, and it's kind of a lot to review at once. So one suggestion is to filter down by sector and end use of an area that is most interesting for you, or you have expertise in that area. For example, HVAC equipment, it is easy to filter down to all the HVAC measures, and you can review that block a little bit easier than the entire sheet. Alternatively, you can also filter down to measures that have been added or updated since the last study. That might be of interest. And then there's also filtering on behavioral emerging technologies, and we'll talk about those in some later slides. From sending out that measure list, we are hoping for some feedback from stakeholders, for all of you that are on this call. And really, we want to make our measure list even more comprehensive. And so we are requesting feedback from you. And really, it's around what measures that we have maybe forgotten, or if there are specific measures in Wisconsin that really shouldn't be considered on this list and should be removed. Are there emerging technologies that should be considered and need to be added to the list? Or really, in addition to that, are there additional data sources to help inform measure characterization that is different than the TRM, for example? I want to say one note, we've already started receiving feedback from various stakeholders. I want to say a big thank you, keep them coming. We compile all the feedback from everyone, and we will indicate what action was taken for each of the pieces or each of the measures that you have responded to or provided information on. Once we have done that, the final measure list will be provided by November. We'll email that out and post it on our website. Again, there's a few comments that we've started receiving, and perhaps this is a good time to bring up a few. I know one of the comments was related to the potential inclusion for solar PV, if it should be included within this study. And currently, this study is going to be primarily focused on energy efficiency and not solar generation. I don't know if Mitch or Joe want to add additional context, but I just wanted to put that out there. I don't know if Kathy, if you wanted to talk, put you on the spot there, but if we wanted to talk further about that.
This is Mitch. I'm happy to just kind of jump in to provide some input on my end.
Okay.
Yeah, so this potential study is really kind of modeled off the prior potential study that's referred to quite a bit that was done in 2016 and in 2017. And when I say modeled off of, in terms of study budget, it's pretty similar, a little bit less than the prior study. That study also did not incorporate renewables, solar PV, and that kind of stuff. So what we're really modeling this scope for this study off of is to bring in new information and research on energy efficiency measures to make sure that they're up to date, reflective of the current market, updating some of the research on some of the items that the commission's going to make decisions on for the next quad, like carbon pricing, emphasis between energy and demand, and looking to run a variety of scenarios to understand energy efficiency potential under different policy conditions. So that's the primary emphasis of the study. The current study that was approved by the commission, like I said, is not quite as large as the last study, understanding that there's some efficiencies that could be gained with an update. So it doesn't leave us with a lot of resources to expand this study to include renewables. And in talks with the study team, there's pretty compelling reasons to want to analyze renewables and renewable potential as a standalone study, rather than as measures kind of tacked on to the measure list. There's just a lot of considerations involved with adding it as an additional measure that really merit quite a bit of discussion and attention on its own, that would be challenging under the current study's budget and timeline. And there's some considerations on the economics of it that were identified, I think there's a 2009 potential study. Some of those considerations would be worth revisiting in terms of how the true benefits of renewables are appropriately accounted for. Under the framework of a traditional energy efficiency potential study, there's some considerations there that we would want to make sure were really discussed, and that the objectives of what we'd want to really understand from looking at renewables were really fleshed out, and make sure that the appropriate stakeholders were engaged, and to really do it justice. As you can imagine, there'd be a lot of assumptions that would be required in terms of future market for renewables and adoption and that kind of thing. So there's not an identified source of funds and resources to really dig into that kind of study right now. Is not to say that there couldn't be at some point, but that's a bit more of a broader conversation. It's probably more of an ongoing type of dialogue instead of just folding it in as a measure or set of measures in this potential study.
Thank you, Mitch.
Sorry, we did have a chat from Kathy. Do we want to address that now or wait for later?
Now is fine. I mean, this is this is good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kathy, do you want to just unmute yourself and let us know?
Sure. Is this working? My little high-tech setup. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I guess I appreciate that we're a little deep into this already, but it's also the case that for the market at this point, the price of renewables is falling so quick. The price of solar PV is falling so quickly that this is where a lot of customers are starting now. It's bringing along other pieces, and I guess I'm a little concerned that we're excluding it because it didn't fit very well in 2009. The market has changed dramatically since then. This feels like, and I say this a lot to you guys, this is a really important potential study because we're kind of realigning our heads. And so I guess I was hopeful that there maybe was a way. I mean, the reality is most commercial customers are installing systems that are a small fraction of their overall load. It seems to me you can model that as an efficiency measure that does particular things to demand and consumption and sort of at least help us understand how it fits into the whole here a little bit better. But I'm not a modeler, so that might be that it just looks simpler to me. But I'm concerned that when the market has changed so much, we're sort of using a business as usual that doesn't recognize that, I guess, is my core observation.
Hi there. This is Heather Allen from Renew Wisconsin chiming in. Yeah, this is a really interesting topic for us, of course. And I'd like to echo what Kathy's saying, and I'd also sort of, I think this is potentially part of a bigger question, as you reference. You really want to do, if you do such analysis, you want to do justice to all the assumptions that would go along with renewables. But I think if you could look at this simply from an efficiency perspective, there would be a lot of value. We noticed that solar hot water was on the list, but solar PV was not. I mean, I do think that if you're considering solar hot water to be efficiency, then you could certainly make the argument that solar PV serves as an efficiency measure too. So I'm really appreciative of this discussion and would love to hear specifically what the barriers would be to adding this in as an efficiency approach. And then if not that, what can we do to make sure that we are properly evaluating the impact that renewables can have on reducing energy usage? Because I do think we're missing some data to be able to make proper decisions here. This is a huge part of the market. For me, just a little anecdote, solar was my gateway into this. It wasn't energy efficiency. But now I'm, obsessed with energy. And I think that's true for a lot of customers because solar is easy to access. It's visible. So just to echo Kathy's point and some of the other conversations that have been happening between the last meeting and this one, I really think we should have a discussion on this that's pretty robust.
This is Scott Blankman. If I might build off of Kathy and
and the previous comment by Heather, I also think that if we think about renewables and solar in particular, I think we also then need to be looking at how we evaluate the benefits and the TRC ratios. I mean, based off of the Cadmus report previously, you know, we've got different calculations, or we've got calculations that come up with those ratios for renewables, for rural programs, pilot programs, and the core energy efficiency program. And obviously, when you look at the timing of consumption, as well as the timing of production of solar, and if you're going to begin taking a hard look or a more in-depth look at the carbon benefits that come from when energy is saved, and also when energy is produced by solar, the carbon benefits, you know, and the carbon intensity that it could potentially be displacing could be significant. So I think I would also support, you know, a broader conversation that looks at this through, we get to a quad planning process and we begin to assess how we would be evaluating the benefits and quantifying the benefits. How does all of this fit together so that if we do include renewables as part of this approach, how would we make sure that we're gathering the appropriate information to be able to have an apples and apples comparison between traditional energy efficiency as well as renewables on a, you know, looking at solar as well.
Yeah, thanks everybody for those comments. I definitely don't disagree with that. Those are all really good points, and the fact that the cost of solar is going down so fast, and it's not as though that's not understood and that we're trying to. I think where it fits in is where it's a little bit, you know, the most tricky in terms of this particular study. I don't know if anybody on the Cadmus team can speak to the solar hot water versus solar PV and kind of how that, you know, how those two measures do or do not fit. From that perspective, I don't. That was a question that I heard too. So.
Yeah, I can help answer that, Mitch. Solar hot water, solar thermal systems, they in terms of energy efficiency in our minds, you know, it's not a generation type of technology. It is rather changing the load requirements for a water heater, versus solar PV is generation. It's not necessarily changing the efficiency of equipment per se, or changing the load that the actual piece of equipment is actually using. But you know, these are all valid points that everyone's bringing up. But in terms of the context of why solar thermal is included and solar PV isn't, it's really comes down to solar thermal isn't necessarily, it's not providing generation as compared to solar PV, and there's really when we think about how solar PV fits into load forecasts, and maybe Lakin can provide a little bit more context around that. It had some different implications on a modeling perspective than solar thermal would.
And I can, this is Lakin. I can just offer a few points about how Cadmus has typically modeled renewable potential or solar PV potential, and just generally how other others out there have taken, what sort of approaches other firms or other organizations have taken. And so we definitely do have experience in that area. It does require a bit of a different approach. The good news is a lot of the data that are required to sort of build up an analysis from the bottom is similar to an energy efficiency potential study. But once you get sort of beyond, characterizing the building stock, then we run into the need to take sort of a fundamentally different modeling approach. And so most of our team's experience modeling solar PV potential is really with respect to looking at, customer-sided distributed generation. So really practically limited to solar PV potential from rooftop installations. There certainly are, the ability certainly does exist out there. And we've done it in some instances to look at, community solar or ground mounted solar or large arrays that would be more utility scale and require more complex interconnection. And so I think first and foremost, really need to understand sort of what the limitations are on the approach and sort of what the breadth of the analysis sort of would require. And then from there, some of the other differences, I think Kathy mentioned price and changing price. Anytime you're looking at a singular technology, particularly one like solar PV, where there have been obviously demonstrated changes in price over time, we also have to consider what the changes in future price look like, and whether that's relying on forecasts from NREL or other organizations of that type. It does get, does come into the calculus quite a bit. And we don't typically forecast changes in efficiency, the cost of efficiency over time. So that is a difference. It does require a different sort of modeling approach, both from just a technical aspect, and then trying to understand. I think the biggest challenge with modeling PV potential, particularly for customer-sided generation, is trying to understand what may happen in the near term and in the medium term with respect to adoption. And solar, I don't need to tell everyone else out there, but with sort of the way that various tax incentives and have been structured in the recent past and proposed changes to the ITC, the economics of some of these projects for utility customers, is going to look quite different. And so, all in all, it's not hugely challenging, but there are some really critical assumptions that have to be made to look at sort of what we expect the market potential to be. So Mitch, I'll stop there. I just kind of wanted to summarize, differences in modeling approaches and considerations that have to be made.
Thanks, Lakin. See that Kathy added another question to follow up. Kathy, would you like to expound?
Not a question, just clarifying that I agree we can't predict future prices, but my understanding of the way, Lakin, you explained the economic potential before is it's looking at current prices into the future. Even that analysis for PV, I think, could be as useful as some of the other technologies on the list. I mean, there are lots of unpredictable pieces with lots of things, but.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And I think, I'll just clarify, just the rate at which, the prices have changed over time and the way and the rate at which they're predicted to in the future is sort of something that, has to be from a modeling standpoint taken into account to sort of say, like, what do we think is going to affect customer adoption? Well, at least some part of that equation is an expectation around what the payback is. And so, today it's a whole lot better than it was in 2009, I'm assuming, and that may look even more different in 2030. And so it's just a different, just a kind of I guess a difference in approach and modeling between what we typically do for energy efficiency that has to be taken into account.
Yeah, and I think just to maybe hit back a little bit on a comment that Scott raised, that a broader conversation in terms of assessing how to quantify the benefits. That's an aspect of quad planning that we have some ability to provide alternatives to the commission. We can look at price of carbon, and historically the commission has made decisions on that. And the way that the commission has approached renewables is to have a budget that they've agreed upon to be established for a particular quad. So for this current quad, the annual budget amount is, I think, $5.5 million a year, and so that's traditionally how the commission's approached it. So that's understanding how renewables are viewed compared to energy efficiency, and that type of decision is, I think, somewhat useful context there too, but a broader conversation about what those benefits look like with the emphasis is related to energy and demand and the carbon price. Those are all kind of broader topics that feed into this too. So it's a deep conversation that is ongoing. I've just encouraged that to keep going, but in terms of the scope and budget for this energy efficiency potential study, we've just got some challenges with roping it in that are just a reality.
Oops, sorry. Thank you, Mitch. I'll considering time, we'll move on, and we have further opportunities to discuss measures. So I will move on. Stepping back a bit, we have shown this figure regarding our potential study approach in the past. But what I really want to emphasize is, where does measure characterization fit in all of this? And our engineering team will tell you, characterizing all the inputs for all the measure permutations in a measure list is a thorough undertaking and really the bedrock of the potential. And really, it really starts with a robust data collection task where we're pulling information from new and existing primary and secondary data sources. And all of that information informs the calculations, not only for the energy efficiency measure, but also the baseline end use consumptions. And that is broken down by sector and market segment. In addition, measure characterization also provides or informs some of the technical characteristics of each measure. And that might be sort of these applicability factors around the technical feasibility or limitations to install a particular measure. There's also, we need to account for measure interactions, as well as just the saturations of equipment and things like that. while we shared with you a unique measure list by sector, that unique measure list is ultimately going to be expanded by the sector and the segments within those sectors. And then it's further expanded within each segment to the appropriate end uses, as well as vintage. And so while there may be a unique set of measures, the number of permutations is quite large. To put this into context, the prior study had more than 26,000 measure permutations, and each permutation has something different about it. There might be differences in savings because there's a difference between the segment. For example, a single family versus multifamily, the savings values could be different for a particular measure. There's also going to be differences between vintage and of course by end use. And so ultimately it ends up being a pretty robust engineering process. So I just wanted to note that. But really what I wanted to focus on was what measure characterization really determines. I know I talked a little bit that it provides energy consumption and savings, but within that, we're also accounting for the primary and secondary fuel savings. And what I mean by that is to appropriately assess the economic potential or to determine if a measure is cost effective. This study needs to account for those primary and secondary savings. So when assessing the electric potential, like a retrofit attic insulation measure, it saves electric savings, say from a central air conditioner. And that represents that primary savings. But there's also secondary savings for those customers who have, say, natural gas heating. And so we want to account for that, that secondary fuel savings when we assess that cost effectiveness. So we have to do those calculations as well. There's also interactions, savings interactions that we want to account for. And a lot of this is stipulated through the Wisconsin Technical Reference Manual, but it includes, say, installing an efficient lighting measure results in cooling load decrease, and so we want to capture those savings when we do the calculations. In addition, we also calculate water savings, say from faucet aerators or low flow shower heads and other measures that save water. And typically we calculate that in the number of gallons saved. The characterization also includes incorporating equipment and labor costs for both the baseline and measure for the permutations. This may also be in an incremental cost value for both equipment and labor. We sometimes incorporate, depending on the measure, we'll incorporate an annual O&M. And typically this is around replacement costs when a baseline lifetime is different than a measure lifetime. A good example of that is, say, a halogen bulb has a lifetime of 2 years and an LED has a lifetime of, say, 12. There are periodic annual replacements that occur over that time, and we want to account for those costs. We also assign effective measure lives for both baseline and measure permutations. And most of that comes from the focus on energy TRM. For each measure, we assign these applicability factors, and I touched on that a little bit earlier. One of them is a technical feasibility. That is the percent of homes or buildings that could feasibly install a measure. And not every building may be applicable to install a measure. There might be space limitations, or it's just not, the technology is just not feasible for that particular end use. And so we have to apply some limitations for a particular measure to avoid overcounting the potential. In addition, we also include what we call percent incomplete. That's the percentage of remaining homes or businesses that are yet to install this energy efficiency measure. Or one way of thinking about it, it's 1 minus the current saturation of the measure. So let's say an Energy Star refrigerator, 25% of the population already has an Energy Star refrigerator. So the percent incomplete would be 1 minus 25%. So 75% of the remaining population could still install this measure. In addition, we also include modeling flags in the potential study. More of this is to inform how the potential study model incorporates measures into the potential analysis, but we assign measure stacking and competition flags to avoid overestimation of the potential. Can pause there if anyone has any questions before I go to the next slide.
Hi there.
Yep.
I might be
Hi.
having a technical difficulty.
Okay.
My slides are not advancing on my screen.
Oh.
I don't know if anyone else is seeing that.
I actually ran into that earlier today when I was doing a test run. It may be best to leave the meeting and come back. That was the only way that I was able to solve that. Did you see a little spinning icon in the middle of your screen?
I don't have that, but I'll
Okay.
try that. I'll log out and log back in. Thank you.
Okay. All right. As she logs back in, I'll slowly talk a little bit through the main sources that we're going to be using for. We're on slide 11. Someone just asked what slide we're on. So we're currently on slide 11, and just about to go over the main data sources. So where does all this information come from to inform measure characterization? Well, it really comes from sort of our main sources, which would be, as I noted, the 2020 Focus on Energy Technical Reference Manual. That has a lot of calculations and data to inform the savings, equipment costs, effective useful life, but it doesn't provide everything. And so we need to look at other sources as well. And we look at the Focus on Energy evaluation data. Some of that comes from their program data or spectrum. There is equipment sales data that we incorporate, as well as if there are applicable evaluation reports and things of that nature that can help inform the measure characterization. As I noted before, primary data collection is informing a lot of the inputs for the energy consumption, but it also provides a look into technical feasibility and percent incomplete values as well, as we receive information on saturations and efficiency shares from the primary data that we collect. Even with all these great sources, there's always data gaps, which we have to fill from supplemental sources. We will be relying on the 2016 study, as well as Department of Energy documents, EIA survey data, such as the Residential Energy Consumption Survey or the Commercial Buildings Consumption Survey. There's a Manufacturing Consumption Survey as well. We look at Energy Star, other TRMs, and of course, Cadmus research that we will either from prior studies or any data that we need to collect as part of this study. I just want to note that at the end of this deck, we added a reference slide that has more details about the information on the sources that we're using for this study. All right, I'll briefly describe the process that we go through. Won't spend too much time here, but we analyze each measure in an individual workbook that contains the savings, the cost data, the factor assumptions, the effective useful life. And then we use a Power Query process to combine all the workbooks into one single measure input model. And that input model contains the per unit and the per building measure inputs that ultimately that feeds into the potential study models to that include the segmentation and the number of buildings and the service area, and we can calculate the technical and economic potential. One, I did want to note one thing before I move on around. This is a slide that really has more about how the potential study treats measures, and not necessarily the measure characterization, but we thought it was it would be good to define this here because it does help provide some definition around measure characterization. Ultimately, we classify measures into two categories, equipment measures and non-equipment measures or retrofit measures. And so equipment measures, they directly affect the end use equipment, such as a high efficiency central air conditioner. And equipment measures normally follow a replacement pattern based on projected equipment turnover. In this study, we use 1 over the lifetime of that equipment. Non-equipment measures, on the other hand, or retrofit measures, they affect the end-use consumption without replacing that end-use equipment. A good example of that is insulation. There aren't any time constraints from turnover when installing retrofit measures. So savings could really ultimately be acquired at any point in the planning horizon. And really, at that point, we incorporate ramp rates for different measures to address the timing of which those retrofit measures come into the study. Just want to note that our treatment of early replacement, most measures naturally turn over within the study horizon. So long-term technical potential for early replacement measures ultimately equals the same savings as replace on burnout measures. And early replacement could be, however, considered in short-run program potential. Our potential study plans to exclude early replacement from the analysis, but it's something that can be or should be considered in terms of program design for that short-run program planning potential. All right, codes and standards. Our study does account for codes and standards that are changing over the study horizon. Incorporating codes and standards affects customers' energy consumption patterns and behaviorals over time. This determines which measures continue to produce savings. So for a standard, here's an example, a standard heat pump that the federal standard is a SEER 13, will no longer be manufactured, or sorry, I said that wrong. A SEER 14 standard heat pump with a SEER 14 will no longer be manufactured starting in 2023 and will become SEER 15 as the standard after 2023. So therefore, the savings, when we calculate the energy efficient heat pump savings, those savings will have to account for that change in savings due to the change in SEER value. It actually also impacts the heating side, the HSPF, but for an example, I was just providing that. State codes typically impact new construction measures. And one thing to note is that our study does not try to attempt to predict how standards might change in the future. For example, we only know the efficiency criteria of today's enacted standard, and we can't necessarily predict how those efficiency requirements could change 5 or 10 years from now, because it's just they haven't started evaluating what those efficiency requirements are going to be. Was there a question? For the residential and commercial sectors, we plan to use current building codes for the state of Wisconsin. As of right now, we are not aware of any pending legislation that would change this in the near term. And we're using the current enacted and any sort of pending federal standards that are on the books as of today. One area that I think could use some discussion around is how we plan to treat residential lighting. As you know, this is, for most of you, it's been a hot topic over the last couple of years. And considering the continual uncertainty in this sort of evolving environment around ISA, there are lawsuits, there's shifts to market adoption of LEDs, and this has implications to the study. So Cadmus is working with PSC staff and how to best characterize residential lighting savings. We may, like the prior study, we may look at various scenarios. In the last study, we looked at different scenarios around the timing of when ISO would occur for the standard A-shaped lamps, for example. I think there's more to account for this time. And so I think I want to pause here to see if anyone has any comments or feedback that could help inform how to really best characterize lighting potential for this study. If not, there are always opportunities to follow up later. Again, oh. Hold on a second.
This is Scott Blankman with Clean
Yep.
Wisconsin. Perhaps just not so much a solution, but more of a question thinking about the quad planning process and the use of scenarios. Given that the lighting programs have a significant impact on the programs, given their relative size on the benefits, I'm curious as to how these scenarios would factor into the final program design, given some of the uncertainty surrounding the lighting programs and some of the lighting standards.
Scott, this is Mitch. That's a great question. I think that's a question that a lot of people have, that a lot of planning and analysis kind of yet to be seen there, and I don't know that there's a succinct response that I can give. I think it's part of what we're hoping that this potential study will shed some light on in terms of other opportunities that might be out there that can be worked into program design and implementation, but the scenarios themselves would result in different kind of profiles of what potential savings there are out there left for lighting, which would play into that planning. But it's, at least in my view, it's kind of too early to tell how that would factor into program design. But if anybody else would like to comment on that, that's welcome to do so.
Yeah, this is Bobby Fay with ICF. I know we're certainly right in the middle of discussions with Cadmus, more on the evaluation and changes to the TRM. So I'm curious kind of how those are we going to try to align this approach with I would say it's a very different approach than what is being recommended for adjustments to the TRM for this coming January. So just curious if there is opportunity to try to align these two approaches, because I agree that it would be a lot of guessing to make changes right now, and there isn't standard change or exact knowing where the lighting market will go.
Thank you, Bobby. Yes, I know internally we have started coordinating with the evaluation team here regarding residential lighting in particular. So just to let everyone know, we will be, or I will be in the next meeting talking about this with you coming up here shortly, that I believe Matt Glusenkamp has provided some information on. So.
Great, sounds good, thanks.
Yeah.
There was also a question from Kathy, not about lighting. It was about if we're taking into account local building guidelines. For example, Eau Claire has issued a net zero building code, and various Wisconsin residents live under communities with aggressive climate goals. And Kathy, feel free to elaborate if I didn't summarize that well.
Just that it's not a code. Eau Claire can't issue their own code in Wisconsin, but they have a guide and they're working really closely with builders and developers to move their market to net zero buildings. And, you know, lots of us are watching them and thinking about how we can do that in our communities. A third of Wisconsin residents live in communities that have aggressive climate goals. 1 in 3. So there is, like, I sort of think the code a little bit misses the point at this moment more than usual, kind of thing. And I'm not sure how to reconcile that, but I think it's again an issue where I think the potential study in some way needs to acknowledge all of that local initiative that's going on that's trying to accelerate action around efficiency.
Good comment, Kathy. In my mind, this is a question more around the sort of adoption of energy efficiency measures and at the speed of which that would occur within the potentials assessment. You know, it doesn't necessarily impact the technical or perhaps the economic potential, but it does have some you know, potential impact to how quickly people will adopt measures within the state. I have I have about three slides left, and would like to sort of talk about 3 measure groups that were of primary interest in the last study, and thought it was important to talk through them here as well and get your feedback and sort of talk through some of this. The first one is emerging technologies. We include, we started with the 2016 emerging technologies that were commercially available but nascent in the marketplace. And so this is one of the areas that I would like to talk a little bit more about. The further slides are going to be behavioral and process measures. But the first one is emerging technologies. Here's a couple of examples. We have heat pump dryers, advanced heat pump water heaters, and advanced dedicated outdoor air systems, network lighting controls, for example. And actually, in some of the feedback that we've received on the measure list already, had some suggestions about additional emerging technologies to include. So thank you for that information. By all means, please send more if there are, and we'll consider them. As you know, there are limited data when adding in emerging technologies. And primarily, you know, we focused on emerging technologies that are currently available, but we didn't necessarily include non-commercially available emerging technologies. And so this study is going to be focused on the same approach as we did last time. We also want to avoid overestimating the potential because not all of the emerging technologies may be completely accepted in the marketplace in the time horizon of the study. And so we want to either apply a technical feasibility factors or account for this in our ramp rates, but we want to account for, we just want to make sure we don't overestimate the potential for some of these new measures that aren't completely accepted yet in the marketplace, or the cost may just be too high. So I probably don't need to open it up for everyone, but that's, please send an email with any emerging technologies that we should potentially consider. Any additional data would be very helpful. As I said before, there's not always a lot out there, so that would be great. The next topic is behavioral measures. Again, we plan to start with the 2016 behavioral measures that we included. Some examples of that are Wi-Fi thermostat seasonal savings, direct feedback or home energy reports, strategic energy management, and then this delivery energy efficiency together, or DEET, for schools and government, which is a current, or which was a program for schools and government. And so by all means, please send some other suggestions to consider, to include, and to see if it's applicable for the study as well. The last topic is industrial process measures. Within the potential study context, it is difficult to characterize a very customizable measure that is very specific to one facility. And so that's always been a challenge for potentials assessments. And in the prior study, 36% of the electric industrial economic potential was process related. And based on that results, stakeholders from the prior study provided feedback that this potential is likely much higher, considering the process loads are such a predominant amount of the overall industrial load. And so we want to try to address this in this study. So a couple of things that we're doing is that we are asking more questions, process potential questions, for our industrial expert interviews that we're conducting as part of this study. And in addition, we are adding 2 process-related measures. The first is a general sort of process improvement measure that covers a specific process end use. And process improvements can be considered as continual improvements. So in this case, we're going to assume a level 2 represents the incremental savings from our sort of standard level 1 process improvement. And this would basically add on top of the existing process improvements that would occur later in the study. We also have other plant, this is pretty general. We have very general categories in industrial, but we also have a operationals improvement. And this is more considered to be behavioral, but that's something that can impact the process loads as well. All right, I think we did it. Thank you for walking through that. If there are any questions or comments, I think there were a few that popped up. So let me see if I can find them.
I can also help you there,
Okay,
Aquila.
yeah.
The first was from Scott, and it was about emerging technologies and how we are going to consider storage, especially given our prior discussion on solar PV, and also, do you know how other studies have treated storage? And of course, Scott, you're welcome to elaborate further if you'd like.
I think you captured it pretty well. It's just kind of more of a, general sort of thought as to how it's being considered. I mean, there are certain energy efficiency programs across the country that are beginning to incorporate storage as a way to manage, the timing of consumption, and be able to contribute to some of the carbon intensity and carbon reduction benefits that come with that. So I was just kind of curious how it's being considered, or have you seen it modeled in other jurisdictions that you've worked on?
I can add to a little bit to that, and perhaps Lakin can add some as well. Typically, energy storage, in terms of analyses or projects that we've done in the past, we typically do incorporate that within solar PV analysis, sort of the combination solar and storage applications for residential and sometimes small commercial. And we, depending on the approach, sometimes we look at energy storage as sort of, I guess what we call a sort of a tipping point analysis of looking at the cost in which how big the energy storage system would be, considering when you're accounting for all the costs. But in our minds, it is, we see more adoption around energy storage in connection to solar PV. And so I think it seems more attuned to incorporate energy storage within a solar PV study, for example.
I could just note that, a limitation of focus is that it's as defined in Act 141 is that, it's not to include load management. So that's an area where focus, the policy defining statewide program has an impact on that kind of thing. Typically, it's a utility kind of arena to this point.
Mm-hmm.
So another question from Kathy, but industrial process savings. Have we assessed, or could we assess the portion of industrial savings that's process related to provide a benchmark for future savings?
Yes, the short answer is yes. That can help inform that. I think there are some potential challenges there, in part because process potential savings can sometimes be difficult to capture without a large overhaul within a facility's operation. but yes, I would say it is a useful benchmark, and we have some data, obviously, that we're going to try to incorporate from focus programs to help inform this. But I think there's likely still process savings potential in addition to what's currently being captured in programs, because it can be difficult to achieve without yeah. I think there's another question.
Sorry, I muted
okay.
myself. It was Ingo, and it's pretty long, so maybe I can invite Ingo to share directly.
Yeah, sorry about that. I couldn't figure out how to ask that briefly, but let me explain what I'm trying to get at in a different way. Maybe it'll make sense. So you had mentioned, I'm thinking about behavioral measures, just to put this in context, and what I might be able to suggest or not. So you had said when you talked about emerging technologies that you're not looking at emerging technologies that are not already available in the market, and that you don't want to overestimate. So with that in mind, I was thinking about behavior change and the home energy reports. And I've long thought that the way home energy reports are currently implemented leaves potential savings on the table because they're designed to be mass produced and vendor friendly, but there are more savings to be gotten with more customized approaches, less marketing or less mass marketing, mass production sort of approach. So my question to you is, are you interested in, and would Wisconsin want to look at, more innovative tweaks to existing behavioral measures, or for the potential study, are you just looking for what is currently out there, offered by vendors, that could be copied and pasted into Wisconsin or continued in Wisconsin? Does that question make sense?
I think it does. I think yes, I think we're in agreement here. I think we want to, we will want to account for the inclusion of home energy reports. That's sort of it's a standard offering through programs. But I think there are, and I don't know if we should classify that as emerging technologies or not, but there are, as you noted, new ways to design and implement these interactions of behavior. And I think the short answer is that yes, we want to incorporate that. We didn't identify that as a line item on our measure list, but it is something that we will document now. And we have looked at this in other areas as well. And so yes, I think we do want to capture that, I guess it's transformative way of looking at behavioral change other than home energy reports. In the last study, we did look at direct feedback behavioral changes, but I think this is more than that, and if I'm understanding you correctly, Ingo, that it's more than just direct feedback. There are just other advancements of just providing behavioral change versus than just receiving a report, if I'm understanding correctly.
Correct. I'm thinking of improvements to the report, improvements to how it's implemented, but also going outside just the report paradigm to address behavior, but building on the idea of social norms and the like.
Understood. Yes. Okay. Noted. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I'm over time. I'm sorry, everyone. Thank you for enduring all of that, and thank you very much for all the feedback that you have provided, and hopefully for those that can provide additional feedback, please do send an email. All of this helps. So thank you very much, and I'm going to hand this over to Lakin.
All right, thanks, Aquila. I'm just doing a quick time check here. I've got 22 minutes past 2 o'clock, and the next portion of the stakeholder meeting is to discuss scenario potential. Mitch described in his opening remarks that we would be providing an update on our progress on this topic since the last stakeholder meeting. So on slide 20, I just wanted to summarize some of the work that our team has been engaged with since the last stakeholder meeting. Jeremy, have you advanced to slide 20? All right, thanks. And so since the last stakeholder meeting, we have had several consultations with the Public Service Commission, and the staff there has developed recommendations to the study team to consider with support from Commissioner Huebner. So here, I just wanted to summarize what those consultations and recommendations have included. And so we are not going to rely on willingness to pay surveys as a primary data source for determining potential. We've also been directed and considered how to leverage prior potential study data and historical program data to the extent practical. And then, of course, we do intend to continue to seek and encourage stakeholder guidance. So we really want to be able to rely on expertise from stakeholders and those who have deep awareness of efficiency markets within Wisconsin to inform and assess the appropriateness of assumptions that we're making with respect to scenario potential, and to help us understand where there may be additional data sets that would improve the outcome and the potential estimates themselves. Some additional recommendations include maintaining transparency regarding data and assumptions, and then estimating potential for focus under varying budget levels and policy assumptions. So we will include some additional information in the upcoming slides about some of these scenarios, but really the intent there is to present a range of outcomes under different futures. Again, it's a 12-year study. The first year of the study is 2023, it goes through 2034. So with any future-looking work, we do want to consider scenario options based on different assumptions about what the future may look like. We also will avoid using the term achievable potential, both in the presentations, in the literature that we develop and put on the website, and in the study report itself, so that we can, avoid potential misinterpretation of the results. And then finally, we have convened a stakeholder subgroup to communicate, preferred direction as we move forward throughout the project. That stakeholder subgroup has met already, and we've discussed with them some of our proposed proposals and some of the recommendations from PSE staff. So on slide 21, I just wanted to summarize some additional research that the CADMAS team has undertaken. Again, we did receive quite a bit of feedback around our what we previously referred to as achievable potential and the initial proposed methodology. We're obviously pretty well aware of the varying methodologies out there, and so we decided to do a bit of a deeper dive on additional studies, both from utilities and from other statewide energy efficiency potential studies, just to make sure that there wasn't anything else out there that was new or innovative that we should consider. We also had received quite a bit of stakeholder feedback regarding the Minnesota statewide potential study that was completed, I believe, in early 2019. And so we did reach out directly to CEE staff there. Both myself and Mitch had a great conversation with Carl Nelson, and really just wanted to take, pass on that, that study itself, really had some heavy reliance on informed opinions, particularly from stakeholders that were involved in the study and involved in the CIP there in the state of Minnesota. And then also we did understand that that study in itself didn't take on any additional primary research to determine what they call it achievable potential. Another bit of analysis that we did in the intervening periods of time was that we did some deep review of historical focus program data, and the primary intent there was to determine the possibility of building individual measure level time series data to try to inform our ramp rate selection. And again, ramp rates help determine what the annual potential within a potential study would be, the rate of deployment for both retrofit and lost opportunity measures. And so we started by looking at residential measures, since many of those are widget based. And the idea was that we would be able to estimate penetration over time as a percent of what the total market would be, and then use those to help determine ramp rates for the upcoming study. Suffice to say, there were a number of data-related issues that really complicated that review. And although we were unable to sort of develop a really holistic, inclusive approach for many different measure types, we did have some limited success with some data. Some measures are a lot easier than others to track over time. And so we do plan to use some of that information as we move forward in the study. But in summary, we weren't able to come up with, a holistic, single approach that we could use to address the ramp rate question. So on this next series of slides, I just wanted to summarize our proposal moving forward. And so on slide 22, we're proposing for optimized potential, a new term, to estimate optimized potential as a percentage of economic potential. We're proposing to take a deterministic approach that is similar to what the Northwest Power and Conservation Council has done in its region-wide energy efficiency potential studies. And so as a percent of the total long-run economic potential, we're proposing that the value will be 85% for most measures, realizing that there are some differences between lost opportunity and retrofit measures, and really sort of the time element that Aquila was referring to earlier, where retrofit measures can be theoretically deployed at any point in time in the study. And then for measures that have historically had minimum federal efficiency standards, we're proposing to set the optimized level to 95%. And the reason for that is that we expect, and there's been recent news recently about the Department of Energy updating minimum federal efficiency standards for appliances and equipment. And so for any end use or piece of efficient equipment where there have historically been minimum federal efficiency standards, we propose to set that optimized level to 95%. And so in terms of being able to make comparisons, the optimized potential will be analogous to the maximum incentive achievable scenario from the 2017 report. On the next slide, Jeremy, on slide 23, I just want to summarize our proposal for ramp rates. And again, there's a diagram at the bottom that shows how different ramp rates are deployed and what percent of the market adoption will be in each year of a study. And so there are differences. These particular ones were from the potential study that was completed in 2017, and it basically shows differences where ramp rates start so at the beginning of a study, where a particular technology may already be with respect to its place on an adoption curve, and then the point by which a measure, would assume to be able to achieve 100% of the market adoption within a given year. And so our proposal for ramp rates in the current study is to first start with the ramp rates we had in 2017, and those were assigned to measures based on the hierarchy that was described in the report. And so we're going to start there, but then we're going to adjust the starting points for measure ramp rates using primary data. And so those data might be from site visits, surveys, market research. For example, some firms collect data, sales data for residential HVAC equipment that includes efficiency designations. And so we may be able to understand in a given year what percentage of, central air conditioners have an Energy Star SEER value. And so that's what we mean by market research, being able to really leverage, data from other data sources. And then, of course, using focused program data to the extent allowable. That program data is what I was describing earlier, trying to look at, for some specific measures, being able to develop a time series of penetration over time. And then in an attempt to maintain transparency and an attempt to engage stakeholders and technical experts, we want to present ramp rate assignments to interested stakeholders and technical experts, and to do so at a point in time at which we'll be able to gather expert feedback regarding reasonableness and to seek consensus on final ramp rate assignments. And so sort of the way that we envision this is, there are many measures in the potential study, and we'll certainly make all of that information available in terms of these initial assignments. But it may make sense to focus on some of the really critical elements and determine what data were used to inform that assumption, our level of comfort with the assumption, and then get information back from program staff, from implementers, from people that are familiar with these markets to understand if they think the rate of adoption over time is appropriate or not. And so we'll be communicating more about that in the near future, but definitely just want to mention that it's part of our thinking in terms of being able to maintain transparency and gather expert feedback. On slide 24, so in addition to estimating, what we're referring to as optimized potential, we do plan to estimate what we're referring to as current policy potential, which will be a subset of optimized potential constrained by annual budget amounts based on current focused funding levels. However, the study will also consider additional scenarios of funding between what the current policy is and then that optimized level of potential. But for the current policy potential, one of the key elements there will be measure incentives. And so in order to estimate the current policy potential, we'll have to have some assumptions about what incentive amounts are. And we plan to start from what the current incentive levels are, expressed as a percent of incremental cost. And then for measures that are in the study that aren't currently offered by programs, we're going to have to develop proxy incentive amounts for non-program measures and emerging technologies. And then the total budget amounts that will allow us to sort of constrain the optimized potential to develop current policy potential will include both incentives and implementation administrative costs based on recent focus experience. And then we'll have to scale the optimized potential to current policy potential, considering the equitable balance of ratepayer funding. What we mean by that is just ensuring that we have reasonable funding splits between fuels and customer classes, and that the money coming in, the money going out are relatively similar to one another across customer classes and gas and electric energy efficiency. Slide 25 just briefly mentions what we plan to do to continue to educate and maintain transparency. So as I mentioned previously, we do intend to make the optimized and current policy potential designations, estimates, and the calculations available on the study website. So rather than presenting results and just saying this is what we've done, and then providing a final report or draft and a final report, we're going to include some additional workbooks that show how we get from economic potential to the current optimized potential and current policy potential designations, and what those calculations actually include. And then here in the near future, we're going to go ahead and post the 2017 potential study ramp rates to the study website. They were available as part of the last study, but the intent here is to provide more data and more information, and really highlight some of the critical assumptions that were made, and for some of the highest savings measures, so that folks who are interested can become more familiar with that process and those data sets. Finally, on slide 26, I just want to mention, in addition to the optimized potential and the current policy potential, the potential study will consider savings potential under different scenarios of key inputs to help inform scoping for quad planning. So one of those scenarios, of course, is a baseline of no changes, but we do plan to look at a range of scenarios, as I mentioned already, looking at differing budget constraints between current policy and optimized potential, and then also looking at changing key input values, such as what we assume about carbon emissions values or discount rates. And those types of inputs really affect what the economic potential will be. So I'll stop there. Jeremy, on slide 27, the floor is open for any feedback, any questions that folks may have about potential calculations, about how we plan to do stakeholder engagement going forward, or just any other general questions or comments.
We did have a chat from Kathy, and to summarize, and of course Kathy jump in, happy with the approach, but notes that the implementation team will need to be active in sharing insights on the adoption rates, and feel free to add.
Let me just reinforce this, because lots of us were concerned about willingness to pay as the way to identify that final potential. And Cadmus has worked really hard to come up with another way. This way is only going to be as good as the input they get from experts in these technologies. So people on the program team should fully expect that as I watch this process, you may get a call from me if I think Cadmus isn't getting enough help from your sector. Fair warning for everyone, because I really want this to work, and it's going to need your team's market insights to make it happen.
Appreciate that, Kathy. Thank you. And yeah, I want to give kudos to the Cadmus team for being extremely flexible on this and digging far into the weeds on some of this stuff. And if anybody needs a terminology cheat sheet, we should probably develop those, because we're using some terms that are pretty, I think they're somewhat new to the traditional potential study terminology, but we hope serve a better purpose and help someone reading the study have a better sense of what they're seeing in the outcomes. We're calling it scenario potential, because really these are all plausible scenarios that are going to come out of this, not trying to emphasize one over another as being a more likely future, but that they're all scenarios that should be considered in planning for the future of focus on energy. And with the optimized scenario, and the business, or the current policy scenario, those are sort of the bookends of where things could go. So we anticipate needing some conversations along the way just to establish definitions, but hopefully it's a more instructive outcome than maybe it has been.
We just also had a chat from Robin about the approach for determining carbon values.
Hey, this is Mitch. I can speak to that. We're undertaking some research to inform that discussion, seeing where things are now out there in the world for alternatives and options for carbon values. If anyone followed the quad planning process for quad 3, know that there was some research and some alternatives presented to the commission there for decision. And so that will very likely once again occur. So we want to make sure that we've got up-to-date information and data to help inform those decisions. So that's some research that's currently underway. I'm not exactly sure when that's wrapping up, but we'll be able to share that information once it's available.
Okay, great. Any other questions on scenario potential? Okay. So lastly, we wanted to provide an update on our data collection process, and this is not an item where we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of everything that we're doing, since we covered that at our last stakeholder meeting, but rather to provide an update of where we are in that process of collecting all of the information that will feed into the measure characterization work that Aquila has discussed earlier today. So in terms of our update, we have our surveys underway, our telephone surveys underway for the commercial segments, and there were 9 commercial segments where we were doing these phone surveys and collecting key equipment saturation and end use data. So we're starting, still starting out, but they're going well. About 58 of the 630 targeted surveys are completed. We are moving ahead with our industrial expert interviews, and possibly several of the folks on this call have been interviewed. And again, that's to collect more detailed information about remaining potential opportunities in the industrial sector. We're also moving ahead with our agricultural phone surveys, and those are working well, and we're getting responses and making progress. And again, there we were gathering some supplemental data to our really extensive research effort for the prior study. A little change in how we're collecting the general population residential key equipment saturation and end use data. We had initially talked about doing an email survey. However, when we received the customer contact information from our utilities, we found that basically there was a large variance in the number of customers that had email addresses, and we don't know why. Between maybe 50% and 10% of the customers had email addresses in the database. So instead, we have opted to buy a representative panel of survey responses from our email survey provider. So we will get 600 completed surveys distributed across Wisconsin according to the residential utility customers. So these can be targeted by zip code, and they will be representative to the Wisconsin population. And the benefit here is actually that we can get a much larger sample size. We are also doing telephone surveys for income qualified customers, and those have not started yet. And essentially the surveys ask the same question as the general population residential, but they are going to be specific for income qualified residents. The bigger update is about our virtual site visits. So the last time we met, we told you about some of the challenges that we would face going on site to commercial customers and collecting information via direct visit due to the coronavirus. And so we talked about doing a pilot to conduct these site visits virtually, meaning we use an application that allows us to essentially see the facility through the camera lens of a local staff person's smartphone and have them essentially go through the facility, taking pictures of equipment, lighting types, essentially equipment that you would look at in person. And so we did complete a pilot and found that we can collect key lighting data and the key equipment data that we're looking for. There is a time constraint because we are asking essentially to have a facility staff walk through through their business, which basically means we're a little bit more limited on what we can collect, but find that we can collect the key data virtually. And so we're moving ahead with those virtual site visits and are making some progress and really currently ramping up our recruitment. Again, our primary focus, given our time constraints, is on lighting and HVAC equipment. So those were our updates. I think if there are questions about site visits or essentially anything else that we have talked about so far, this is our general Q&A section. We have about 10 minutes left, and we're happy to respond to your inquiries. Doesn't sound like we have any additional questions. So if anything does come to mind about the measure feedback or anything that we haven't covered or that you would want to provide further feedback, please feel free to email either myself or Mitch, and our emails are listed below. And a heads up, our next stakeholder meeting we're looking at conducting in November, and that will focus on potential modeling and the scenarios to be analyzed. Mitch, is there anything else you would like to add?
Just to echo what you said, Jeremy, if anything pops to mind, please feel free to email me or Jeremy or both of us at any time.
Great. Well, we can end about 10 minutes early then. We appreciate everyone's engagement, and thank you very much.
Yes, thanks, everybody.